Having talked about the refutation of idealism, we now get to the postulates of empirical thinking in general proper. And these are about the last three categories of the possible, the actual, and the necessary. So let's read what Kant says about them. At the very beginning, he tells us, whatever agrees with the formal conditions of experience, in accordance with intuition and concepts, is possible. So something is possible if and only if it agrees with the formal conditions of experience. And we're going to see that Kant will make a distinction between like what we might call bare logical possibility, like there's no contradiction in an idea, and sort of this real possibility that he's interested in, which requires more, right? It requires that one is in agreement with the formal conditions of experience. So that has to do with intuitions, and it has to do with the categories, and not just with the merely analytic principle of non-contradiction. 2. That which is connected with the material conditions of experience, of sensation, is actual. Right? To be actual, to really exist. What does that mean? Well, if I sense something, it's actual, right? But that would be a little bit too strong, too narrow, right? If I say that something exists, if I sense it, well, surely there are lots of things that exist that I don't sense, right? I, for instance, have never sensed Australia, and yet presumably Australia exists, and maybe some of you who are watching this are watching from Australia, in which, hi, you probably exist. So what is needed is not that it is sensed, but that it is connected with the material conditions of experience. And what that means is that, well, I mean, a basic way of thinking about it is I have these sensations of things, and those things and events which I sense have connections of causation and community with other things and events. And if they have that, then we're good, right? Whatever stands in a causal relation or a relation of community with something that I sense exists. And so, although I personally may not have sensed Australia, well, I have been in some of the objects that I've been in contact with have been in contact with Australia. I have friends who went to Australia. Or maybe there is a more sort of a longer chain of objects or events that leads from my sensations to Australia. But as long as there's some chain like that, right, it's okay. There is a connection, and so there is actuality. Then the third is that whose connections with the actual is determined in accordance with general conditions of experience exists necessarily. And this is going to, I think, require a little bit more of a story. So I'll talk about that when we actually get to the idea of necessity. Okay, so here is what Kant starts to say in the elucidation. He says the categories of modality have this peculiarity. As a determination of the object, they do not augment the concept to which they are ascribed in the least, but rather express only the relation to the faculty of cognition. So, and he goes on to say that how is the object itself, together with all its determinations, related to the understanding and its empirical use, to the empirical power of judgment, and to reason in its application to experience. For this very reason, the principles of modality are also nothing further than definitions of the concepts of possibility, actuality, and necessity in their empirical use. So what Kant is telling us here is that the strange thing about words like possible and actual and necessary is that when I use them to talk about things, I'm not really giving you any new information about the thing. Right? A possible table is just a table. An actual table is just a table. I mean, these words function very differently from green, right? A green table, oh wow, that's a particular kind of table. Possible and actual do not function like that. And I think this is very useful for, well, actually, if only contemporary philosophers had been aware of this before they started taking possible worlds talk so seriously. Some of them. A there's no such thing as a possible table in a sense, right? I mean, it's not like there are the actual tables and then there are also the possible tables, and who knows, maybe there are some necessary tables. That's not the way it works, right? That's not the way that we have to think about this at all. When we think about possibility, actuality, and necessity, Kant says, they express only the relation to the faculty of cognition. How? Well, a possible thing is something that is related to the faculty of cognition. In which sense? Oh, in the sense that once we have analyzed the conditions of experience, it fits those conditions, right? So it is something that we might experience. An actual thing, oh, that is something which is actually connected to sensation, in the sense that either we sense it or it stands in some relation to something that we do sense. A necessary thing is something that we actually, our understanding has to posit as occurring in experience, right? So all of this is not really about the objects themselves, it's about how they relate to our understanding, our sensation, our faculty of cognition. Okay, so again, the possible. Here's what Kant says at A220. It is approximately where B268 begins. That in such a concept no contradiction must be contained is, to be sure, a necessary logical condition. But it is far from sufficient for the objective reality of the concept, that is, for the possibility of such an object, as it is thought through the concept. So what Kant is insisting on here is that merely not being a contradiction tells us nothing about whether something is possible. Thus, only from the fact that these concepts, and I'm a page down, only from the fact that these concepts express a priori the relations of the perceptions in every experience, does one cognize their objective reality, that is, their transcendental truth, and to be sure independently of experience, but yet not independently of all relation to the form of an experience in general. So in order to know that something is possible, I don't need to have particular experiences, but I do need to know what the form of experience is, right? In other words, I precisely need to know what the analytic up until now has taught me, and then I can see whether something is possible in an a priori sense of the word. Okay. So this, of course, allows Kant to sort of get rid of all kind of weird possibilities, right? If somebody says, okay, well, but surely an uncaused event is possible because there's no contradiction in that thought. In fact, you yourself say that there's no contradiction because you claim that the principle of causation is synthetic, not analytic. So an uncaused event must be logically possible. Kant is going to say, well, you know, there's some bare logical sense in which it might be possible, but it's not really possible, right? It's not something that we could possibly find in the world, that could possibly be in the world, because it doesn't fit the a priori conditions of experience. And of course, I mean, this way of thinking about possibility is obviously very closely connected to transcendental idealism. Okay, the actuality. This is the beginning of A225. The postulate for cognizing the actuality of things requires perception, thus sensation of which one is conscious, not immediate perception of the object itself, the existence of which is to be cognized, but still its connection with some actual perception, in accordance with the analogies of experience, which exhibit all real connection in an experience in general. That is, okay, nice. You know, that is what I said. We don't have to sense something, but it's got to be connected through sensation and community to whatever I've been sensing. Kant goes on to say that in the mere concept of a thing, no characteristic of its existence can be encountered at all. For even if this concept is so complete that it lacks nothing required for thinking of a thing with all of its inner determinations, still existence has nothing in the least to do with all of this, but only with the question of whether such a thing is given to us, in such a way that the perception of it could in any case precede the concept. This is going to turn out I mean, these ideas about what existence is and how it relates to concepts, the concept of a thing, is going to turn out to be very, very important when we get to the ideal of pure reason and the ontological proof of God. Because the ontological proof of God basically says that it is part of the concept of God that God exists. And Kant is going to say, this is a completely wrong way of thinking about existence. And here we sort of learn why. This is sort of the basis for what Kant is going to say later on. Okay, then the third postulate is material necessity in existence. Kant says at A226, just after the refutation of idealism. It pertains to material necessity in existence, not the merely formal and logical necessity in the connection of concepts. Right? So Kant is here, I mean, he's not interested in a circle must be round. Right? That is a kind of necessity, but that's a purely logical necessity. Doesn't have anything to do with existence, or what has to happen, or what has to be. Now, what could be necessary? Right? Are there, the traditional philosopher would ask Kant, are there any necessary beings in the world? Right? Things that have to be, that couldn't not be. Here's what Kant says about that. He goes on, now since no existence of objects of the senses can be cognized fully a priori, but always only comparatively a priori relative to another already given existence, we just read that existence has nothing to do with concepts, right? Something has to be given to us before we can postulate its existence, or at least something has to be given to us, and then maybe we can postulate something else's existence, but something has to be given to us. So if we think about necessary existence, something that has to exist, independently of what is given to us, we will come up empty. Right? There's nothing. So does that mean that the category of necessity is empty, that there are no necessary beings? Well, Kant is going to go on to say, no existence of objects of the senses can be cognized fully a priori, but always only comparatively a priori, relative to an other already given existence. So it's true that there are no a priori necessary things, but given one thing, something else can be relatively necessary. It can be necessary given the first. And of course, this is precisely what the law of causation is all about. Right? It is about, if one thing happens, something else has to happen too. So that is actually the kind of necessity that Kant is going to find in the world, and also the only kind of necessity that Kant is going to find in the world. Now, there is no existence that could be cognized as necessary under the condition of other given appearances, except the existence of effects from given causes, in accordance with laws of causality. Thus, it is not the existence of things, substances, but of their state, of which alone we cognize the necessity, and moreover only from other states, which are given in perception in accordance with empirical laws of causality. Empirical laws also, right? So we don't know in advance what the laws of causality are going to be. We only know that they are going to be there, but it's an empirical investigation what form they actually take. And so a little bit later on, Kant tells us that everything that happens is hypothetically necessary. It is necessary given something else. Right? Everything that happens is hypothetically necessary. Necessary given something else. If you know a little bit about Kant's ethical philosophy, you will see the difference between this and what he says about duty, right? Because in morals, it's all about precisely not what is hypothetically necessary. I mean, there's a hypothetical imperative, but it's not really important. I mean, it's not the centerpiece of ethics. It's the unconditional necessity that becomes important there. The categorical rather than hypothetical imperative. Okay, so that is basically these three categories. And Kant goes on to say a little bit more. He is, for instance, this is around A229, going to talk about the four kinds of unity that we need in the world. So he tells us that there is no hiatus, no leap, no chance, no fate. Which I read as, being related to those four sets of categories. Like a hiatus would be a gap in space. Right? There's something, then there's nothing, and then there's something. Or in time, there's something, and then for some time there's nothing, and then there is something again. That can't happen. That would sort of destroy the unity of things. There is no leap. This has to do with these intensive magnitudes, right? We saw Kant claim this in the Anticipations of Perception. We can't have something that's a little bit warm, and then suddenly, immediately, without any continuous thing in between, it's very hot. There's no chance, right? Everything has a cause. And there is no fate, which basically means that we don't have these necessary objects that are not just hypothetically necessary, but they're just there. And that too would, in a sense, destroy unity, right? I mean, there's all these things that are connected with each other, and then there's this necessary thing. That would be weird, right? That would destroy the unity of the world. Okay, so Kant says, well, none of that exists. And we now know why, right? I mean, that just doesn't fit the rules of experience. Which, of course, all of them are based on the necessary transcendental unity of experience. So this is not a surprise that all these kinds of disunity don't exist. It sort of follows clearly from the system. Then Kant spent some time talking about the relation between the possible, the actual, and the necessary, and asking questions like, well, are there any sort of things that are possible but not actual, things that are actual but not necessary? How exactly does this work? I don't think this is like super important for most purposes. Yeah, I'm not going to say too much about that. So let me read out something that happens at the very end of the postulates. We're at A234. Since they are nevertheless always synthetic, they are so only subjectively. That is, they add to the concept of a thing, the real, about which they do not otherwise say anything, the cognitive power whence it arises and has its seat, so that if it is merely connected in the understanding with the formal conditions of experience, its object is called possible. If it is in connection with perception, sensation as the matter of the senses, and through this determined by means of the understanding, then the object is actual. And if it is determined through the connection of perceptions in accordance with concepts, then the object is called necessary. The principles of modality therefore do not assert of a concept anything other than the action of the cognitive faculty through which it is generated. And so again, Kant affirms that these things only have to do with the way that the understanding works on experience, but also this allows him to affirm that all these categories only apply to whatever is given or could be given in experience, right? And that means that talking about necessary beings, I mean, there's no necessary beings in experience, but it also doesn't make any sense to talk about necessary beings outside of experience, right? Again, the categories do not apply beyond the realm of possible experience, right? Kant can never, he can't say that enough times, and so he reiterates that again. Okay, so there is a general note on the system of principles in which there are a couple of remarks on inner sense that might be relevant in relation to the refutation of idealism. And he reiterates what I just said at the very end, which is that all principles of the pure understanding are nothing further than a priori principles of the possibility of experience. And all synthetic a priori propositions are related to the latter alone. Indeed, their possibility itself rests entirely on this relation. So again and again, Kant will tell us everything we've said, these categories, these principles, it belongs to the realm of possible experience. You cannot take them outside the realm of possible experience, as we will see at length in the dialectic. But before we get to the dialectic, there are a couple of things that Kant wants to say, like some methodological remarks and some remarks on his particular version of idealism, how to think about these distinctions particularly the distinction between phenomena and noumena. That's going to be the next chapter. And then there's this wonderfully called amphiboly, in which he basically looks at the way that his thinking relates to that of Leibniz. So we are going to do that, and then we get to the dialectic.